It was a typical Wednesday morning in the city. The sky was a dull gray, the kind of morning that made people want to stay wrapped up in blankets, but the world had no time for such luxuries. Commuters bustled around, walking briskly, each with their own destination in mind. Tom sat in his usual spot at the corner of his apartment, trying to finish the last bit of his coffee before he had to catch the subway. He was a man of habit, someone who found comfort in his routines. He lived alone in a modest apartment, worked a 9-to-5 job at a marketing firm, and most days, his biggest concern was getting to work on time. Tom had never been one for excitement. He wasn't particularly outgoing, nor did he seek attention. He preferred to blend in with the crowd, follow the rules, and go about his business. There was a rhythm to his life that he cherished, a rhythm that no one ever seemed to disrupt. That was, until today. His morning started like any other, the rush to get dressed, a few words exchanged with his landlord, and a hurried breakfast. But the moment he stepped out into the street, everything changed. It wasn't the weather or any external force, it was the people. The subway station, usually a place of dull faces and routine glances, seemed to be alive with an unusual tension. People jostled for space, speaking hurriedly into their phones, checking their watches as the train was delayed. Tom could feel the tightness in the air, the low hum of anxiety that seemed to pulse through the crowd. He stood at the entrance of the station, staring at the yellow line on the ground. The trains were packed, and it was clear that the usual chaos of commuters was going to be even more chaotic today. As the train pulled into the station, Tom braced himself, knowing it was going to be another cramped, uncomfortable ride. He sighed, reminding himself that this was just another part of his daily grind. He pushed forward with the crowd, his body pressed up against others, a sea of bodies all trying to make it to their destinations in the same narrow, unfeeling space. The doors opened, and the usual rush of people shoved their way into the car. Tom didn't mind the crowd, he'd grown accustomed to it. He positioned himself near the pole, holding onto it for stability as the train lurched forward. The air was thick with the scent of body odor, stale coffee, and the musky smell of leather from coats that had been worn too long. People stood shoulder to shoulder, barely able to move, each of them lost in their own thoughts, too focused on their phones or the day ahead to pay attention to anything else. Tom was no different. He pulled out his phone, scrolling through emails and checking messages, zoning out in the familiar hum of the subway. That's when it happened. A slight shove. A tap on his shoulder. It was small at first, nothing alarming, but it broke his concentration. Tom instinctively looked up and saw the man standing directly beside him. The man was dressed in an old leather jacket, faded jeans, and worn boots. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and had a stern look on his face. But it was the look in his eyes that caught Tom off guard. Something about them was cold, calculating. There was an intensity there that didn't belong in a place as mundane as the subway. The man didn't say a word, he just stood there, staring ahead, seemingly unfazed by the packed train. Tom felt a slight surge of irritation. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was the close proximity, the pressure of so many people, or just the general discomfort of the morning, but something about this man's presence made Tom uneasy. He shifted his stance, subtly adjusting his position to create a little more space between them. But the man didn't budge. He remained where he was, almost as if he had no intention of moving at all. Tom could feel the space between them getting smaller, and his irritation began to simmer. The train rumbled along, the usual clattering noise filling the air. Tom, trying to maintain his composure, shifted again, this time stepping back slightly, but it didn't help. The man was still standing far too close, his body pressed against Tom's, making the already cramped space feel even more claustrophobic. Tom's irritation grew. He didn't say anything, he wasn't the confrontational type. He wasn't the kind of person who would cause a scene over something as trivial as this. But in the pit of his stomach, a storm was brewing. His patience was thinning, and his mind raced with frustration. Why couldn't people just respect personal space? Why did they always have to stand so close, invade the little room you had left to breathe? His hand clenched the metal pole in front of him, his grip tightening as the train jolted again. And then, without thinking, it happened. Tom, in a moment of pure frustration, opened his mouth and spat. It wasn't much, just a small, quick spit aimed at the ground, but it was enough. The spit missed the floor and instead landed directly on the man's face. Time seemed to slow down. Tom's eyes widened in disbelief as the spit splattered across the man's jacket and cheek. A rush of panic surged through his chest. The man didn't move at first. He stood there, frozen, as if the world had momentarily stopped spinning. Tom's heart began to race. His stomach dropped. For a moment, Tom didn't know what to do. He couldn't apologize, he hadn't meant to do it. He had just been so angry, so overwhelmed by the crowd, that he didn't even think. He could feel the man's eyes on him, but the gaze wasn't one of surprise or anger, no, it was something colder, more deliberate. The man slowly turned his head toward Tom, his eyes locking onto his with a silent fury that sent a chill down Tom's spine. There was a stillness in the air as if the whole subway car had collectively held its breath. The man wiped the spit from his cheek, but he didn't say anything. He just kept staring at Tom, his eyes unblinking. Tom swallowed hard, feeling the weight of the situation closing in on him. He could sense the tension in the air, the quiet anger building between them. The other passengers seemed to notice, too. The air in the subway car felt thicker now, the discomfort palpable. Tom could feel sweat beading on his forehead, despite the coldness of the train. The moment dragged on, each second stretching out longer than the last. He opened his mouth to apologize, but no words came. The man continued to stare at him, his expression unchanging. Finally, the man spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You just made a huge mistake," he said, his words cutting through the silence. Tom's throat went dry, and he immediately wished he could take back the moment. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just stepped into. The man's tone wasn't just angry, it was calculating, as if he knew exactly what he was doing. Before Tom could respond, the train pulled into the next station with a sudden jolt, the doors opening to let more passengers flood into the already crowded car. The man didn't move. He didn't budge a single inch, and for a second, Tom thought he might just get off the train without another word. But then, the man spoke again. "I'm not done with you," he said, his voice colder now. "We'll settle this later." Tom's stomach twisted in knots as the man finally turned and walked off the train, leaving Tom standing there, breathless, confused, and incredibly uneasy. He glanced around at the other passengers, who had witnessed the entire exchange. Some were pretending not to notice, their eyes glued to their phones, while others couldn't hide their curiosity. The atmosphere in the train was thick with the tension that had just unfolded. Tom let out a long breath, his heart still pounding. He wanted to forget it, to move on with his day and pretend like it had never happened. But he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment, this mistake, was going to change everything. And he had no idea just how right he was. The rest of the ride felt like a blur to Tom. The usual noise of the subway, the rhythm of the train tracks, the announcements echoing through the speakers, it all felt distant, muffled. His mind kept replaying the moment, over and over again, as if trying to find a way to undo it. He could still see the man's cold, calculating eyes fixed on him, still hear his voice cutting through the tense silence. "You just made a huge mistake." The words seemed to echo in Tom's head like a drumbeat, each repetition growing louder, each one sinking deeper into his thoughts. When Tom finally arrived at his stop, he barely noticed the bustling crowd around him. He shuffled his way off the train, his legs feeling like they were made of lead. The station was as crowded as ever, but he felt strangely detached from it all. The usual hustle and bustle of his morning commute had lost its color, its vibrancy. He moved through the crowd mechanically, barely aware of his surroundings. His mind was consumed with the events of the past few minutes, the image of the man standing there, the icy stare, the promise of retribution. By the time Tom reached his office building, his palms were sweating. He fumbled with his keys, the sharp edges of the metal digging into his skin. He finally managed to unlock the door to his apartment, stepping inside and closing it behind him with a soft click. The silence of his small apartment enveloped him like a heavy blanket, but it didn't comfort him. He stood in the doorway for a moment, unsure of what to do next. His thoughts were a whirlwind of anxiety, guilt, and confusion. Tom knew that the man from the subway wasn't someone to be taken lightly. He had sensed it in the way he carried himself, the way he looked at Tom, as if he knew exactly who he was dealing with. Tom wasn't a tough guy. He had never been involved in anything that could be called trouble. He didn't have a violent bone in his body. He just wanted to get through the day without drama, without confrontation. And yet, here he was, standing at the edge of something that felt far beyond his control. As the minutes passed, Tom tried to push the thoughts out of his mind. He sat at his desk, opened his laptop, and tried to focus on his work. But it was no use. Every time he tried to concentrate on a report or an email, the image of the man in the subway would flash before his eyes. Tom could still feel the weight of the man's stare, the coldness in his words. He tried to convince himself that he had overreacted, that it wasn't such a big deal. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't something that would just disappear. The man had promised that he would settle it later. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Around midday, Tom received a message on his phone. It was an unknown number, and his stomach twisted as he read the message. "Hope you're ready. I'll be seeing you soon." A chill ran down his spine. He stared at the screen, unsure of how to react. He felt his heart pounding in his chest, his fingers trembling as he held the phone. Was this a threat? Was the man actually coming after him? Tom's mind raced as he considered his options. Should he go to the police? Should he just ignore it and hope that the man would forget about him? Neither option felt right. He knew that the situation was more complicated than that, but he didn't know what to do. Tom spent the rest of the afternoon in a haze, trying to focus on work but constantly distracted by the message. He couldn't concentrate on anything. Every time his phone buzzed, he flinched, wondering if it was the man again. By the time he left the office, the uncertainty and dread had built up to an unbearable level. He walked to his car slowly, his mind heavy with thoughts of what might happen next. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something he wasn't prepared for. The following day passed without incident, but the tension never left. Tom's mind was consumed by the fear that the man from the subway would show up at any moment, that he would be waiting for him around every corner. Every noise, every person he passed, seemed to trigger his anxiety. He couldn't focus on anything, couldn't find peace in any moment. His world had been upended by a single act of frustration, and now he was trapped in the aftermath. It wasn't until the following week that the next chapter of this unsettling ordeal began to unfold. Tom was on his way to work when he saw something that made his heart stop. The man was standing outside the subway station. Tom recognized him immediately, despite the distance between them. The same leather jacket, the same cold, calculating stare. The man hadn't changed. But this time, there was something different about him, something darker, more menacing. The man wasn't alone. He was standing with two other men, both of them just as imposing as he was. They looked like they could have stepped straight out of a crime movie, their faces unreadable, their body language aggressive. Tom's heart began to race as he approached the subway station. He tried to act casual, to avoid eye contact, but the man saw him immediately. The cold, piercing gaze locked onto Tom's, and Tom felt a knot form in his stomach. The man didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stared, waiting. Tom knew what this was. This was the moment. The man had come for him. He didn't know how he had found him, or what had brought him to this point, but there was no denying it. The man wasn't just angry anymore, he was out for something. Tom couldn't help but feel like he was being hunted, like the man was playing a game with him, and Tom was the prey. As Tom got closer, he tried to gather his thoughts, to figure out what to do next. He considered running, but that would only make it worse. He thought about calling the police, but would they even be able to help? Tom had no idea who the man was, or what he was capable of. All he knew was that he was in over his head. The man's eyes never left him. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he took a deep breath and walked past the man, careful to keep his head down and avoid confrontation. His steps quickened as he passed the group, but just as he thought he had made it past, he heard a voice behind him. "Not so fast." Tom froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, his mind racing for any kind of explanation, any kind of way out of this. The man stepped closer, his face inches from Tom's. He could feel the heat of the man's breath on his skin, could see the barely contained rage in his eyes. Tom felt like a deer caught in headlights. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The man spoke again, his voice low and menacing. "You thought you could spit in my face and get away with it? You thought I wouldn't find you?" Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His hands shook as he clutched his bag, his mind spinning with fear. He had no idea what the man wanted from him, or how far this was going to go. All he knew was that his life had been flipped upside down by a single moment of frustration, and now he was stuck in a nightmare of his own making. The man's gaze never wavered, and Tom realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only getting started. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the man's cold eyes locked onto him. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear, the bustling subway station, the commuters rushing by, the noise of the city, all drowned out by the steady, overwhelming beat of his pulse. Tom's breath was shallow, his body frozen in place, trapped in an atmosphere of escalating tension. The man didn't move, didn't say anything more, but the weight of his presence felt like a physical force pressing down on Tom's shoulders. He could hear the quiet shuffle of footsteps nearby, the murmur of conversation, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the man in front of him, standing there with an expression that was impossible to read. Tom's mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. What did the man want? Was this just intimidation, or was there something more to it? For a moment, Tom considered running. The idea flashed through his mind with such intensity that he almost acted on it, but something stopped him. Was it fear, or was it the recognition that running would only make things worse? The man seemed to relish in the power he held over Tom, his stillness only adding to the mounting pressure. Tom took a shaky step backward, then another. But the man's gaze never wavered. "What do you want from me?" Tom finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt dry, constricted by the knot of anxiety and fear that had settled deep in his chest. "Why are you doing this?" Tom had no idea who the man was, or what he was capable of. All he knew was that he was in over his head. The man's eyes never left him. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with anticipation. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he took a deep breath and walked past the man, careful to keep his head down and avoid confrontation. His steps quickened as he passed the group, but just as he thought he had made it past, he heard a voice behind him. "Not so fast." Tom froze, his blood running cold. He turned slowly, his mind racing for any kind of explanation, any kind of way out of this. The man stepped closer, his face inches from Tom's. He could feel the heat of the man's breath on his skin, could see the barely contained rage in his eyes. Tom felt like a deer caught in headlights. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The man spoke again, his voice low and menacing. You thought you could spit in my face and get away with it? You thought I wouldn't find you? Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady his breathing. His hands shook as he clutched his bag, his mind spinning with fear. He had no idea what the man wanted from him, or how far this was going to go. All he knew was that his life had been flipped upside down by a single moment of frustration, and now he was stuck in a nightmare of his own making. The man's gaze never wavered, and Tom realized that this was just the beginning. Whatever this was, it wasn't over. It was only getting started. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as the man's cold eyes locked onto him. For a moment, everything else seemed to disappear, the bustling subway station, the commuters rushing by, the noise of the city, all drowned out by the steady, overwhelming beat of his pulse. Tom's breath was shallow, his body frozen in place, trapped in an atmosphere of escalating tension. The man didn't move, didn't say anything more, but the weight of his presence felt like a physical force pressing down on Tom's shoulders. He could hear the quiet shuffle of footsteps nearby, the murmur of conversation, but none of it mattered. All that mattered was the man in front of him, standing there with an expression that was impossible to read. Tom's mind scrambled to make sense of the situation. What did the man want? Was this just intimidation, or was there something more to it? For a moment, Tom considered running. The idea flashed through his mind with such intensity that he almost acted on it, but something stopped him. Was it fear, or was it the recognition that running would only make things worse? The man seemed to relish in the power he held over Tom, his stillness only adding to the mounting pressure. Tom took a shaky step backward, then another. But the man's gaze never wavered. What do you want from me? Tom finally managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. His throat felt dry, constricted by the knot of anxiety and fear that had settled deep in his chest. Why are you doing this? Don't make me come looking for you, the man said, his voice cold again. You'll regret it if I have to. Tom nodded, not trusting himself to speak. The man gave him one last look, a look that sent a shiver down his spine, and then turned to walk away. Tom stood frozen, still processing what had just happened, still feeling the weight of the encounter pressing on him. His breath was ragged, and his mind was a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had no idea what kind of trouble he had just stepped into, but he knew one thing for sure, his life had changed in that moment, and there was no turning back. As the man disappeared into the crowd, Tom stood there for what felt like an eternity. The noise of the station, the hustle of the morning commuters, all of it returned to him in a rush. But it didn't matter. His thoughts were elsewhere. His hands shook as he stood there, staring at the business card in his palm. He had to make a decision. Should he call the man? Should he try to resolve this somehow? Or was that just feeding into whatever game the man wanted to play? Tom's head was spinning. The weight of the card felt heavy in his hand, a tangible reminder of the confrontation, of the danger that now loomed over him. He had no idea how deep this went, but he knew that whatever it wasn't something he could just walk away from. He couldn't outrun this. The man had made sure of that. The train ride home was torturous. Tom's mind refused to quiet. Every bump of the subway, every flicker of the light seemed to remind him that he was being watched, that the man could be anywhere, waiting for the right moment to make his next move. The familiar scenery of the city seemed foreign now, distorted by the weight of his anxiety. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being hunted. When he finally made it home, Tom sat down at his kitchen table and stared at the business card again. He had to make a choice. Should he reach out to the man and try to appease him, or should he go to the authorities? What if the man's threats were just the beginning? What if there was something even darker behind it all? As the hours passed, Tom grew more and more uncertain. He tried to distract himself with work, with TV, but nothing worked. His thoughts kept drifting back to the subway, to the man, to the encounter that had shaken him to his core. Tom realized he couldn't let this slide. He had to do something, even if he didn't know what that something was. But what would he do? Would the police be able to help, or would he be in even more danger by involving them? Tom sat in the silence of his apartment, staring at the card, as the weight of the situation continued to grow. He didn't know what to do next, but one thing was clear: his life, his peaceful existence, was over. And the man from the subway had just begun his game. Tom couldn't shake the haunting thought that his life had taken a drastic turn that morning, a momentary lapse in judgment that would follow him for the rest of his days. As he sat in the small, dimly lit apartment, staring blankly at the business card, the weight of it seemed to grow heavier with each passing second. Every corner of his home now felt foreign, like it wasn't his anymore. The man in the subway, with his cold, unblinking gaze, had changed everything, and Tom knew deep down that he could no longer go back to the life he'd had before. His mind raced as he replayed the events over and over. Why had he spit at that man? What had possessed him to react so carelessly? The man hadn't done anything to warrant it, he hadn't even looked at Tom wrong. But in that split second, frustration, anger, and perhaps something deeper within Tom had taken over. A single moment had set a chain of events into motion, and now, here he was, wondering if he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. The business card sat on the kitchen counter, taunting him. The name on it was unrecognizable, but that number, it felt like a tether, a lifeline that connected him to something he couldn't yet understand. Tom had spent hours wrestling with himself, questioning whether or not he should reach out to the man. He'd considered calling the number a dozen times, but each time he picked up his phone, his hand trembled so much that he couldn't bring himself to dial. What if this was a mistake? What if reaching out only made things worse? But what if the man was serious? What if this was just the beginning of something far worse? The encounter had been so sudden, so intense, that Tom couldn't help but fear the worst. He had no idea what the man was capable of. And yet, deep down, he knew he couldn't ignore it. Ignoring it could be the biggest mistake of all. The days passed in a blur, with Tom constantly glancing over his shoulder, waiting for something, or someone, to jump out at him. The city, once familiar and comforting, now felt like a maze he was lost in. Every shadow, every quiet figure on the streets, made him question whether he was being followed. He kept his head down, avoided the subway, and took a different route to work. But despite all his precautions, he couldn't escape the feeling that he was being watched. The man had warned him that there would be consequences, and Tom couldn't help but wonder if they were already starting to unfold. One evening, as Tom walked home from the grocery store, he noticed something strange. Across the street, a man was standing under the flickering streetlight. Tom's heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively ducked behind a nearby car, watching the figure closely. Was it him? Was this the man from the subway? The man's posture, his stance, it seemed familiar, but Tom couldn't be sure. He waited for what felt like an eternity, his eyes locked on the figure as it stood motionless, almost as if it were waiting for something or someone. But when the man suddenly turned and walked away, Tom exhaled sharply, realizing he'd been holding his breath the entire time. It wasn't him. Or was it? The uncertainty gnawed at Tom's nerves. He couldn't shake the paranoia. He felt like he was slipping into a dark hole, one where there was no escape. Everywhere he went, he was on edge. The man's words echoed in his mind constantly, "You think you can just get away with spitting in my face?" Tom didn't know what he was up against. But the feeling that something was closing in on him only intensified. A few days later, Tom's worst fear came true. He was sitting in his car, parked near a quiet street, when he saw the man again. This time, there was no mistaking it. The man stood across the street, just outside a bar. Tom froze, his blood running cold. The man was staring directly at him, his eyes cold and unyielding. It was like a scene out of a nightmare. Tom's first instinct was to drive away. But something inside him held him in place. He couldn't just run. He couldn't hide forever. Not from this. The man stepped closer, his face illuminated by the streetlights, revealing the same cold expression Tom remembered. Tom's heart hammered in his chest as he opened the car door and stepped out. He had no plan, no idea what to say or do, but he knew he couldn't just stand there. The man was already approaching him, his footsteps deliberate and heavy. "Thought you could get away?" the man asked, his voice dripping with disdain. "I don't forget, and I don't let things slide." Tom swallowed hard, trying to steady his nerves. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to." "I don't care about your apologies," the man interrupted. "I told you there would be consequences, and now, it's time to pay." The man's words struck Tom like a punch to the gut. He felt a rush of adrenaline as he realized how close he was to the man, how easily this situation could escalate into something far worse. Tom's hands trembled as he tried to maintain his composure. The last thing he wanted was for this to turn violent, but everything in his gut told him that was exactly where this was heading. "Please," Tom pleaded, his voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" I made a mistake. I know that. But this isn't necessary." The man laughed, a dark, cruel sound that made Tom's skin crawl. "You think I care about your excuses?" The man took another step closer, and Tom instinctively took a step back. "You disrespected me, and now I'm going to show you what happens when you cross the wrong person." Tom's pulse raced. He had no idea what the man was capable of, and the fear of the unknown was almost worse than anything else. In that moment, he felt completely powerless. The man had him cornered, both physically and mentally. Tom's mind raced for a way out, but all he could think about was the man's presence, looming over him, suffocating him with his threats. The man raised a hand, as if to push Tom, but before he could react, a car screeched to a halt just behind them. Tom's heart leaped into his throat as he turned to see who it was. Was it a friend, a passerby? Could this be the intervention he needed? But as the car door opened, Tom's heart sank. It wasn't a savior, it was someone else from his past. A voice called out from the car, cold and familiar. "Hey, what's going on here?" Tom's eyes widened. It was Mark, an old acquaintance from his past, someone who had no business being involved in this mess. But for reasons Tom couldn't yet grasp, Mark seemed to know exactly what was happening. He had been watching from the car, waiting for this moment. "I said, what's going on?" Mark repeated, stepping out of the car and standing beside Tom. The man looked Mark up and down, sizing him up. For a split second, the tension in the air seemed to freeze. Then, the man slowly lowered his hand, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't your business, buddy." Mark stood his ground, his eyes never leaving the man. "It is now," he said, his voice firm. "Whatever this is, it ends now. Got it?" The standoff between the two men was palpable, a battle of wills that seemed to stretch on forever. Tom's heart was still pounding, but for the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe this was his chance to finally escape. Maybe Mark could help him get out of this mess, could protect him from whatever this man had in store. But the question remained, was it too late for help? Was this confrontation just the beginning of something worse? Tom didn't know the answers, but in that moment, he realized something: he couldn't face this alone. The man had shown him that. This was bigger than just one wrong act, it was about survival. It was about choosing how far he was willing to go to protect himself, and whether or not he could live with the consequences. As Mark and the man locked eyes, Tom stood silently in between them, the weight of his decisions pressing down on him. The clock was ticking, and whatever happened next would change everything. The standoff between the man and Mark felt like it stretched on forever, a silent battle of wills. Tom's heartbeat reverberated in his chest, the adrenaline coursing through his veins. His eyes darted between the two men, each one a figure he couldn't predict. Mark, usually calm and composed, stood resolute, his gaze unwavering, while the man from the subway exuded an intensity that was hard to ignore. The tension hung thick in the air, and Tom couldn't help but feel like he was caught in the middle of a storm he had no control over. Everything seemed to blur in his mind, his past mistakes, the consequences, the fear of what would come next. The raw reality of his choices hit him harder than ever before. This wasn't just a mistake, it was a moment that had irrevocably changed his life. The idea of running, of fleeing from it all, seemed tempting, but deep down, Tom knew he couldn't. It had already gone too far. Mark shifted his weight, standing a little taller, as though daring the man to make a move. The air crackled with intensity, and Tom wondered if this was the calm before an inevitable explosion. Would the man back down? Or would everything spiral out of control? The man's eyes narrowed as he assessed Mark. For a second, it seemed like he was weighing the consequences of going any further, trying to decide if Mark was a threat. Tom held his breath, waiting, praying that Mark's intervention was enough to de-escalate the situation. The man finally let out a low, irritated sigh, and slowly, deliberately, he took a step back. "You think you can stop me?" the man spat, his voice dripping with venom. He shot a glance at Tom, who could hardly process the reality of what was happening. "You're lucky I don't deal with you right here and now, but this isn't over. You'll regret this." Without another word, the man turned on his heel and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the city streets. Tom stood frozen, still processing what had just happened. For a brief moment, it felt like the world had come to a standstill. But as the man's figure faded into the darkness, Tom exhaled a shaky breath. It was over, or at least, it seemed like it was. Mark walked over to him, his demeanor calm, but there was a steely edge to his voice. "You all right?" Tom nodded, still in shock. His legs felt weak, as if they might give out at any moment. I don't know what just happened." Mark studied him for a moment, then gave him a long look. "You've got to stop putting yourself in situations like this, Tom." Tom could feel the weight of Mark's words sinking in. He had put himself in this position, and Mark was right to be angry. But Tom didn't have the energy to defend himself. He just nodded, too exhausted mentally and physically to do anything else. "I didn't think it would go this far," Tom whispered, more to himself than to Mark. He looked down at the pavement, the guilt gnawing at him. I didn't think he'd actually come after me." Mark's expression softened slightly. "People don't always react the way we expect them to. You made a mistake, but that doesn't mean it has to define you. Just, don't do it again." Tom wanted to scream, to ask how he could ever fix something like this. But instead, he stayed silent. The words felt hollow, and the pain of knowing he had brought this on himself was almost unbearable. "Let's get out of here," Mark suggested, his voice a little more gentle now. "You need to clear your head." The ride back to Tom's apartment was quiet. The streets of the city blurred past the windows, the city lights casting strange shadows in the corners of the car. Tom barely noticed the passing scenery, his mind occupied with the events of the night, and the gnawing feeling that this wasn't over. He had been foolish, reckless. And for what? A burst of anger, an impulse that he couldn't control. He had always prided himself on being a reasonable person, someone who didn't make hasty decisions. But that moment on the subway had shattered that image. He hadn't just spit at someone, he had set something in motion that now felt like it was beyond his control. He didn't know who the man was, what connections he had, or what he was capable of. The man had been too calm, too calculating, and Tom knew deep down that he wasn't going to let this go. He'd made a promise that there would be consequences, and Tom had no doubt that those consequences were coming for him. The apartment door clicked shut behind him, and Tom collapsed onto the couch, running a hand through his hair. His body ached from the tension, and his mind was spinning. "Are you okay?" Mark asked from the doorway, his voice quiet. Tom didn't answer right away. He just stared at the floor, trying to pull his thoughts together. "I don't know," he finally muttered. "I'm not sure what's real anymore. I didn't even see it coming, Mark. One second, everything's fine, and the next." Mark stepped into the room, sitting beside him. "I know. But you have to learn from it. You can't keep letting things spiral. Whatever happens next, you have to be ready for it." Tom looked at him, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "What if I'm not ready? What if I can't fix this?" "Then you deal with it," Mark said firmly. "You made a mistake, but you don't get to let it ruin your life. Not unless you let it." Tom closed his eyes, trying to absorb Mark's words. It was hard to hear the truth. He had to own up to what he'd done, face the consequences, and hope that somehow, he could come out the other side in one piece. The man from the subway wasn't just some random stranger, he was a reminder of the fragile nature of control, of how easily everything could spiral out of hand. He ran his hand across his face. He couldn't stay in this state forever. He needed to do something. But what? Mark's voice cut through his thoughts. "You know, you can't keep running from this. If you don't want it to define you, you've got to confront it. You can't hide in your apartment forever, Tom. You have to make the next move." Tom looked at him, the words resonating deep within him. Mark was right. He had spent too long hiding, too long afraid of what might happen next. But if he wanted to move on, if he wanted to survive this, he needed to step up and face the reality of his situation head-on. "I know," he whispered. "I'll make it right. Somehow." Mark nodded. "That's all any of us can do. But you've got to be careful. Not everyone will let you make things right." The next few days passed in a blur. Tom went to work, but his mind was elsewhere, preoccupied with the lingering threat of the man from the subway. The city felt different now, as though it were constantly watching him. He couldn't shake the feeling that the man was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for his chance to make Tom pay for his mistake. And Tom couldn't afford to ignore it any longer. The phone call came on a Friday afternoon, as Tom was sitting at his desk. The number on the screen was unfamiliar, but something in his gut told him he had to answer. He hesitated for a moment, then picked up. "This is Tom," he said, his voice shaky. A cold, low voice answered. "I told you there would be consequences, Tom. And I always keep my promises." Tom's breath caught in his throat. It was him. "What do you want from me?" Tom asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man on the other end of the line chuckled darkly. "I think you know exactly what I want. And trust me, this isn't over. You've got a choice to make, Tom. A choice you'll regret either way." Tom's mind raced. What was he supposed to do now? What kind of choice was this man talking about? But before he could ask any more questions, the line went dead. Tom's heart pounded in his chest as he dropped the phone, his hands trembling. This wasn't just a warning. This was something far more dangerous. The silence in the room was deafening. Tom stood frozen, staring at the phone that had just gone dead in his hand. His heart was pounding in his chest, a sense of dread gnawing at him. The man's words echoed in his mind, sharp and cold. "You've got a choice to make, Tom. A choice you'll regret either way." What did that mean? And how could he fix this? Every nerve in his body screamed for him to take action, but every logical part of him froze in place, unsure of the next step. The man wasn't just a random stranger anymore, he was a specter, lurking in the background, pulling the strings of Tom's life, and it felt like there was no way out. Tom couldn't shake the feeling that his life was unraveling, and no matter how hard he tried to grip onto anything that felt normal, it all seemed to slip further away. The adrenaline from the encounter still surged through his veins, but the fear had taken over, too. He wasn't sure what this man wanted, but he had a feeling it was far worse than anything he had ever imagined. What could he possibly do to get out of this alive? And was there even a chance to make things right? Tom hadn't just disrespected someone that night, he'd made an enemy, a dangerous one, and now he was paying the price. The phone call had shattered any remaining illusion of control that Tom had. The man had been calm, almost unnervingly so, and his words hinted at something far darker than Tom could even comprehend. A part of Tom wanted to call Mark, to explain what had happened, but he knew that there wasn't much Mark could do. The situation had escalated beyond anyone's control. This wasn't just about a wrong done to one person, it was about something far bigger, something that Tom wasn't sure he could handle on his own. As the days passed, Tom found himself looking over his shoulder, every footstep behind him sending a jolt of panic through his body. He couldn't escape the feeling that the man was out there, watching him, waiting for the right moment to make good on his threats. The once comforting hum of the city had transformed into a constant reminder of the danger lurking just out of sight. He avoided crowded areas, took longer routes, and always made sure to double-check the locks when he came home. His life had become a series of calculated decisions, each one motivated by the fear that if he made the wrong choice, it could be his last. But the more Tom tried to control his environment, the more it seemed like everything was slipping further out of his grasp. Each phone call, each unfamiliar knock at the door, felt like the prelude to something worse. He had already been given one chance to make things right, now it was clear he was running out of time. On one particularly late evening, Tom was walking home from a small grocery store just a few blocks away. The streets were quieter than usual, the only sound being the echo of his footsteps. As he walked, his thoughts churned, thinking of the message that had been left on his voicemail that morning. It was from an unlisted number, and when he had listened to it, his heart had dropped into his stomach. It was a threat. A direct, unmistakable threat. The man had left a message saying, "You don't have much time left, Tom. I suggest you make your choice before I do it for you." Tom felt his stomach churn as he relived the chilling words. His mind raced with the possibilities. What choice? What did the man want from him? He didn't know if he could keep living like this, under constant fear, always looking over his shoulder, never knowing if tonight would be the night he would face the consequences of his mistake. But deep down, Tom knew he couldn't keep running. He had to confront this situation. Whatever it took, he had to face the man. He couldn't live in fear forever. That night, as he neared his apartment building, Tom noticed something strange. A figure stood in the shadows at the corner of the street, just out of the glow of the streetlights. For a moment, Tom froze, his pulse quickening. Could it be the man? He took a cautious step backward, trying to get a better view, but the figure didn't move. There was no one else on the street, and the area felt unusually still, the kind of quiet that always made Tom's skin crawl. His mind raced. Should he run? Should he call Mark? Then, the figure moved, stepping out from the shadows, and Tom felt his breath catch in his throat. It wasn't the man from the subway. It was Mark. Tom let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Mark's familiar face, his expression stern but relieved, told Tom everything he needed to know. Mark had been watching over him, just as he promised. "You shouldn't be walking around like this, Tom," Mark said, his voice low but full of concern. "I told you, this isn't just going to go away. You need to be careful." Tom shook his head, feeling a mix of gratitude and frustration. I know. But what do I do now, Mark? I can't keep living like this. The phone calls, the threats, it's all too much. I feel like I'm losing everything." Mark's gaze softened. "We'll figure it out. But you've got to stop acting like you're on your own in this. You've got people who care about you. People who can help." "I can't ask for help," Tom muttered, looking away. I made this mess. I have to fix it. I don't even know if it's fixable. I don't know what this man wants from me, and I don't know if I can survive it. Mark was quiet for a moment, letting Tom's words sink in. We don't always get to choose the consequences of our actions, but we can choose how we respond. That's the only thing you can control right now. Don't let fear drive you to make decisions you'll regret. Tom nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. The fear was overwhelming. The uncertainty was suffocating. But Mark was right. The only way forward was to face the fear head-on. He couldn't let it control him. I'll do what I can, Tom said finally. I'm going to find him. I'm going to make this right. Mark placed a hand on his shoulder. We'll get through this together. But you need to be ready for whatever comes next. This man is dangerous, Tom. Don't underestimate him. Tom didn't respond immediately. The reality of what he was about to do was starting to settle in. He was preparing himself for something that might very well change his life forever. Confronting this man, this stranger, was no longer about clearing his name or apologizing for a mistake. It was about survival. About reclaiming control of his life before the man could take it from him. The next morning, Tom made the decision to take the first step. He had to track down the man. He had to find out who he really was, why he had targeted Tom, and what it was that he wanted. Tom couldn't let this man control him any longer. The thought of facing the man in person made Tom's stomach churn with dread, but he knew it was the only option. If he didn't act now, the consequences would be far worse. Mark helped him gather information, using his connections in the city to dig into the man's background. They discovered that the man had a history of violence, had been involved in organized crime, and had ties to people in power. It wasn't just a random act of aggression, this man was part of something much bigger. Tom's heart pounded as he realized how deep the rabbit hole went. He had never meant for his actions to lead him down this path, but now that he was in it, there was no turning back. With Mark's help, Tom prepared for the confrontation. He wasn't sure what he would do once he found the man, but he knew it would be a fight for his life. As the days passed, Tom felt the weight of the world bearing down on him. Each moment that passed seemed to bring him closer to the inevitable confrontation that would either make or break him. Finally, the day came. Tom, with Mark by his side, tracked the man down to a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. They had the element of surprise on their side, but Tom couldn't shake the feeling that everything was going to unravel at any moment. The man was dangerous, there was no doubt about that. And Tom had no illusions about the cost of his choices. But if he didn't stand up for himself now, he would lose everything. And maybe that was the one thing he could still control. He took a deep breath and nodded to Mark. It was time to face the man.